It's not just a financial shift, it's a seismic shock, a move that could shatter the global order. Imagine this: the US dollar for decades, the unchallenged king of the global economy, is on the brink of losing its throne. And this time, the threat doesn't come from an enemy in a distant land. It comes from within. Could the US truly lose its grip on the world's reserve currency? The answer is closer than you think, and it's unfolding right before our eyes. The numbers speak for themselves. In the last 5 years, China has dumped over $300 billion worth of US Treasury bonds, an unprecedented move that has shaken markets to their core. The once unthinkable prospect of losing the dollar's supremacy is no longer a far-off theory. It's happening now, and it's happening fast. What started as a trickle has now turned into a flood, and the consequences could be catastrophic for the US and the world economy. Let's rewind for a moment. The US dollar has reigned supreme for decades, a legacy built on trust power and the sheer economic force of the United States. It's the currency used in global trade, the currency that powers billions in transactions every day. And with it comes an incredible privilege: the ability to run colossal deficits, carry an almost endless national debt, and still remain the world's dominant economic power. But that's changing. The world is waking up to the reality that the US is no longer the economic juggernaut it once was. One of the key players in this shift is the BRICS bloc: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now expanding its reach to include other rapidly growing economies like Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Together, they represent a population far larger than the G7 and a growing share of the global GDP. These countries, once reliant on the US dollar for trade, are now taking bold steps to break free from its dominance. They're not just talking about it, they're doing it. As the BRICS continue to grow in power and influence, the world is witnessing the decline of US economic dominance. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Despite all the rhetoric, despite all the threats, the United States is losing its grip. Look at the decisions being made. China and India have rejected Trump's warnings about buying Russian oil, continuing to do so at bargain prices, completely disregarding US influence. Meanwhile, Trump's policies designed to protect the US are accelerating the very process he aims to prevent: the end of the dollar's reign as the world's currency. But here's the irony: Trump himself is contributing to the dollar's demise. The US is actively pursuing a policy of dollar devaluation, a strategy aimed at making American exports more competitive. On the surface, it seems like a sound plan, but dig a little deeper, and you see the cracks. A weak dollar might make US goods cheaper abroad, but it also makes imported goods more expensive for American consumers. It's a double-edged sword. What Trump fails to realize, or perhaps conveniently ignores, is that this strategy, while beneficial in the short term for American manufacturers, is destabilizing the entire financial system. And not just for the US, but for the world. The instability that has followed the erratic policy decisions from the White House has caused global markets to rethink their faith in US financial institutions. No longer seen as the safe haven they once were, American assets are being sold off at an alarming rate. If you think the US dollar's reign can't end, think again. The rise of alternative currencies, the global shift towards new economic powers, and the ongoing devaluation of the dollar signal the beginning of the end for the US-centric world order. It's a quiet revolution that's taking place, and the world is watching it unfold, with the US dollar losing its supremacy. What does this mean for the future of global trade? Will the BRICS emerge as the new economic superpower, or is this just a temporary phase? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The effects of this ongoing shift aren't just felt in the US stock market. They extend far beyond Wall Street, affecting everyday Americans and their financial future. For years, the US has been able to run massive trade deficits and accumulate an unsustainable national debt, all while the world continued to buy US dollars and Treasury bonds. But as countries like China and Russia divest themselves of US debt, the foundation of the dollar begins to erode. What happens when global trust in the US dollar diminishes? The simple answer, a financial earthquake. The de-dollarization movement is gaining momentum, and it's not just confined to emerging markets. Even major European powers like Germany and France are exploring alternatives to the dollar in international trade. As the BRICS nations expand their influence, the use of local currencies for trade among their members is becoming increasingly common. In fact, the Chinese yuan is making significant strides toward replacing the dollar in global transactions. In the past, such a shift would have been unimaginable, but now it's happening before our eyes. The global economy is beginning to pivot away from the US dollar, and the consequences are far-reaching. Why does this matter? For decades, the US has enjoyed a unique privilege, the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. This status allows the US to print money without the same level of consequence that other nations would face. It enables the US to finance its debt through the issuance of Treasury bonds, which are bought by foreign governments and institutions. In essence, the world has been financing the US. Governments' spending allowing the US to maintain its global power. But that power is now under siege. The more the dollar's dominance is challenged, the more the US will struggle to maintain its economic influence. As countries like China and Russia reduce their holdings of US debt, the demand for Treasury bonds wanes. This could lead to a rise in interest rates in the US as the government struggles to find buyers for its debt. Higher interest rates would have a cascading effect on the economy, raising borrowing costs for businesses and consumers alike. The ripple effects of this could be catastrophic. But there's a deeper, more insidious risk at play here. The world's reliance on the dollar has allowed the US to exercise considerable geopolitical power. When countries wanted to trade oil, for example, they had to use dollars. When nations wanted to invest in safe assets, they bought US Treasury bonds. The US has used this financial leverage to impose sanctions, manipulate global markets, and enforce its will on other nations. But what happens when the world no longer needs the US dollar to conduct business? The global power dynamics begin to shift. The US will find itself in a position of relative weakness, unable to use its financial might to control global trade and investment flows. This is where the BRICS nations and their expanding influence come into play. They are positioning themselves to create a new economic order, one where the US dollar no longer holds sway. China, in particular, has been aggressive in pushing for the use of the yuan in international trade. In some instances, it has already succeeded, with countries like Russia, Brazil, and even Iran agreeing to trade in yuan instead of dollars. And it's not just about trade. As the BRICS alliance grows, they are also creating alternative financial systems to bypass the US. Dominated institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund (IMF). The new development bank NDB, created by the BRICS countries, is already providing financing for infrastructure projects in developing countries, offering an alternative to Western-backed financial institutions. This is a direct challenge to US global influence, and it's one that could have profound implications for the future of international finance. With the rise of alternative currencies and global financial systems, what will become of the US dollar in the next decade? Is it possible for the US to maintain its economic power, or is the end of the dollar's dominance inevitable? Share your thoughts below. As the global financial landscape shifts, there's a growing realization that the US may not be able to recover its former position as the undisputed economic leader. The world is moving toward a new multipolar economy, one where the US is no longer at the center. The rise of BRICS is a testament to this transition as the alliance grows stronger and more unified. This shift is about more than just trade. It's about creating a new world order, one that challenges US dominance on every front. One of the most significant consequences of this transition is the decline of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. As countries increasingly trade in their own currencies, or in the Chinese yuan, the demand for dollars decreases. And as the demand for dollars falls, so does its value. This process is already underway, and it's accelerating. The most glaring sign of this shift can be seen in the growing use of the Chinese yuan in international trade. China has made it a priority to internationalize its currency, and it's succeeding. In 2023, China's currency became the most traded currency in global commodity markets, surpassing the US dollar in some key areas. More countries are choosing to settle trade deals in yuan, bypassing the dollar entirely. This is a direct challenge to the US, as the dollar has been the dominant currency in global trade for decades. The move toward the yuan is not just a matter of convenience, it's part of a broader strategy by China to gain economic and geopolitical leverage. By reducing the reliance on the US dollar, China is positioning itself as the central hub of global trade and finance. And as more countries join the BRICS alliance and move away from the dollar, China's influence only grows. Meanwhile, the US is stuck in a paradox. Trump, for all his bluster about protecting American interests, has been instrumental in accelerating the very process he sought to prevent. His policies of trade wars, tariffs, and sanctions have isolated the U.S. from its allies and made it less reliable as a partner. The unpredictability of U.S. foreign policy has led many countries to seek alternatives. As a result, the U.S. is not only losing its grip on global trade, but also its geopolitical influence. But there's more to this story. The weakening of the dollar is not just a financial issue, it's a matter of national security. The US dollar has been a powerful tool for projecting American power globally. By controlling the global financial system, the US has been able to impose sanctions, freeze assets, and manipulate global markets to its advantage. But what happens when the dollar is no longer the dominant currency? How will the US maintain its influence when its financial leverage is gone? The answer may lie in the rise of alternative financial systems. The BRICS countries are already building their own financial infrastructure to bypass the US-controlled SWIFT system, the global messaging network used for financial transactions. With China's push for its own payment system, countries can conduct transactions without relying on the dollar or the US strategic-dominated financial institutions. This is a game changer, and it's one that the US is struggling to keep up with. If the US loses its economic dominance, what will become of its role on the world stage? Will the dollar's decline lead to a new global financial order, or will the US find a way to retain its power? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As the decline of the US dollar continues, the world's financial system is undergoing a transformation that could alter the global economic order. The dollar's supremacy has long been a cornerstone of US power, allowing the country to dominate global trade and exert influence over international markets. But as the BRICS nations and other emerging economies turn away from the dollar, the consequences for the US and the global economy could be dire. One of the most significant effects of this shift is the potential for a major disruption in the global financial markets. The US dollar has been the world's primary reserve currency for decades, used in most international transactions and held by central banks around the world as a store of value. But as countries seek alternatives to the dollar, the demand for the US dollar will inevitably decline. This will lead to a reduction in the dollar's value, making imports more expensive for Americans and potentially sparking inflation. But the consequences of this shift go beyond just economics. The dollar's status as the global reserve currency has given the US significant geopolitical leverage. With the ability to influence global markets and impose sanctions, the US has been able to maintain its position as a global superpower. But as countries move away from the dollar, that leverage will diminish. The US will find itself in a much weaker position, unable to exert the same level of influence over the global economy. The implications of this are staggering. A loss of confidence in the US. Dollar could lead to a shift in the global balance of power, with countries like China, Russia, and India taking the lead in shaping the future of global trade and finance. The rise of alternative currencies like the Chinese yuan could pave the way for a new economic order, one in which the US is no longer the dominant force. But it's not just the US that stands to lose. The entire global financial system could be thrown into chaos if the dollar loses its status as the world's reserve currency. The interconnected nature of global markets means that any disruption to the dollar's dominance will have ripple effects around the world. Countries that have relied on the dollar for trade and investment will be forced to adapt to a new reality, one that may be less stable and more unpredictable. So what can be done to prevent this from happening? The U.S. government's response to this crisis will be crucial in determining the future of the dollar and the global economy. Some argue that the U.S. needs to focus on strengthening its domestic economy and reducing its reliance on debt. Others believe that the U.S. should embrace the changes happening in global finance and work to integrate itself into the new world order. Regardless of the approach, one thing is clear: the decline of the U.S. dollar is a process that cannot be ignored. As more countries embrace alternatives to the dollar, the U.S. must decide whether to adapt or risk being left behind in a new multipolar global economy. If the dollar loses its status as the world's reserve currency, how will the U.S. respond? Can the country maintain its global power? Or will this be the beginning of a new world order? Share your thoughts in the comments below.